Salve omnes, and welcome back. In this video, we are going to be looking at Caesar Book 5, chapters 42 and 43, following the AP Latin syllabus. As always, before we begin, let's run through our color coding really fast. Words indicated in red are going to be our subjects. Anything highlighted with green is going to be a verb, and items showing up in blue are direct objects. Beyond that, we have our boldface type that indicates the main clause or thought of a sentence, and then we have our non-boldface type, which indicates anything that is in some way subordinate to the main thought. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive right in. The Nervii have just finished appealing to Cicero and the Romans, trying to get them to leave their winter camps, playing through the same playbook that they successfully used on Sabinus and Cotta. This time, however, they were unsuccessful, as Cicero unequivocally told them that the Romans would not be treating with them, and instead suggested that they could all go talk to Caesar if they had a problem. Obviously, that didn't go well. So, picking up from that point, ab hoc spe repulsi, right? We continue straight on. This is the Nervii, okay? They have been rejected, or we might say disappointed, from that hope. So the hope here, of course, would be their hope that the plan that Ambiorix presented them that did work before would work again. It did not, so they were rejected. They were disappointed. So what did they do? Well, okay, with a wall, we can just continue right on, right? With a wall of 9 feet and a ditch of 15 feet. Notice these genitives right here, pedum, all right? Pedum nonem et pedum quindecim. These are actually something called genitives of measure. Not that you need to know what that is, but that's technically what these are, genitives of measure. So with a wall, we would say 9 feet high, and with a ditch, we would say 15 feet deep. They surrounded the winter camp. So the Nervii are settling in to besiege the Romans. They are investing, is the term, the Roman camp. Well, one might wonder how barbarians living in Gaul have learned siegecraft. Caesar addresses that point. These things, right, this is neuter plural, is referring collectively to the fact that they are investing the Romans, they are beginning a siege against the Romans. These things, both, and then we have here, according to the custom of the preceding years, okay, this ablative and genitive expression comes first. According to the custom of the preceding years, they had learned, notice the pluperfect tense here, cognoverant, they had learned these things a nobis. They had learned from us. So what is this custom of the preceding years? This is referring, of course, obliquely to the fact that the Gauls, particularly Ambiorix and other Gallic tribes that were allied with Caesar, would have served in some capacity, possibly as auxiliaries, possibly there would have been people there being kept as hostages who would have observed the Romans at work. They would have observed how the Romans waged war, and they learned from that. So that's the custom of the preceding years. And so there's another thing, there's another way that the enemy have learned of these things, this art of war, of making war. And that is here, we can start down here. They were instructed by those whom, all right, so the quos here takes eis as its antecedent. They were instructed by those whom they held captive secretly. And then this de exercitu goes with quos, right? So the ones who from the army, so from our forces, they had been holding captive secretly. Okay, so we're potentially talking about, the Gauls have perhaps been capturing Romans on the sly, not letting it be known that they were holding them, and from these captives, they learned these skills. But, as we scroll down, the enemy have some disadvantages. On account of, this is an ablative absolute, nulla copia, right, nulla ferramentorum copia, on account of having, we would say, right, no resources of iron tools. So the Gauls do not have they're not equipped, we might say, with the tools necessary, and that's this phrase right here. With the tools, this quai, by the way, so let's back up 1 second here. The quae, even though we might want to take it with ferramentorum and say that we are talking about the tools which are useful, it's actually, quae is actually going with copia here, and we know that because of esset being singular. Because esset is singular, ferramentorum can't be the antecedent of quae, because quae is singular and ferramentorum is plural. So therefore, the antecedent of quae must be copia. So they had no resource of iron tools which was suited or fitting to this purpose. And what is the purpose that we are talking about here? Well, that's described by what they were forced to do as a result. They strove. Nitebantur governs these two complementary infinitives. They strove, or they leaned into it. But the point is that they had to exert effort to cut the grass or the sod, right? That's what the type of earth that they have there, with their swords, presumably because they lacked plowing material, plowing equipment, things like that, that would easily cut the soil. And they strove to dig out the earth with their hands and their cloaks. All right, so again, they had no earth movers or no equipment that was suited to that because it wasn't something that they did just as part of their daily life. Okay, regardless though, the fact that they had to do all of this hard work actually demonstrates something. And so here Caesar says, indeed, qua ex re, from this thing, the fact that they didn't have tools suited to this kind of work, the number of the men, so we would say like the size of the enemy force, could be ascertained, right? Notice this, Kognoski here is a passive infinitive. So the size of the enemy force could be determined or could be ascertained. Well, how? How could they do that? For minus horas tribus, literally in less than 3 hours. So grammatically, there's something interesting going on here. Minus, of course, is a comparative, which means that oris tribus, as the ablative, is technically an ablative of comparison, because we say less than 3 hours. However, the entire phrase, minus horas tribus, is functioning as an ablative of time. But in this case, it is time within which, not time when. All right, because we've set a limit on how long this took. This took less than 3 hours. So there's two ablative functions going on here. Horas tribus, just those two words, are an ablative of comparison with minus, but then the entire phrase, minus horas tribus, is an ablative of time within which. What did the enemy do in less than 3 hours? A munitionem, so we would say like basically a wall or a fortification. A fortification in circumference of 15,000 feet. Notice again the genitives here, millium pedum, all right, quindecim. 15,000 feet in circumference. They completed. Perfecer. They didn't start it, they didn't work on it, they finished it in less than 3 hours. Continuing on, and on the rest of the days, we've seen this type of expression before when the Gauls first attacked and the Romans had to fight over and over again while doing all that work at night, right? Reliquis diebus, for the rest of the days. What did the enemy do? They started to prepare and build towers to the height of, this would be our rampart, right? The Romans' rampart. These are siege towers. And hooks, and now testudines is tortoises, right? And so we know from thinking about the Roman legion, this is that formation where they would all lock their shields together in order to protect themselves. But in this context, since we're talking about a siege, this would be something like mobile cover, right? Mobile shelters under which the enemy could move and be protected from the weapons of the Romans raining down upon them. So that's what we're talking about here when we say testudines. So, protection, shelter, things like that. Quas, now this quas here, grammatically, it's going with testudines because testudines is closest, but in terms of sense, it's going with the entire thing. All right, it's going with all of this stuff. They learned these things Okay, or I should say, excuse me, this is active because idem captivi are the ones who did it. The same captives, the ones that we spoke of before, who taught them how to do all this siege craft, had taught these things as well. So the enemy had learned from the captives what to do in a siege, about building siege towers, about building these defenses, about building grappling hooks so they could climb up the wall, etc., etc. Okay, so the things are going on, and then apparently 7 days have gone by so far, because we're here now. We see ablative of time. This ablative is on time when? On the 7th day of the battle, right, of the fighting, with this is an ablative absolute, with a great wind, not even just a great wind, but the greatest wind, a very great wind had arisen. Notice coorto is a participle, but the verb orior, that this word is from, is deponent. So this is a perfect active participle, not had been arisen, but had arisen. A great wind, a very great wind had arisen. What did the enemy start to do? Let's scroll down here just a little bit so that we can see what they were doing. They started to throw. What did they start to throw now that this huge wind has kicked up? Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, they started to throw, now this is a little technical here, they started to throw glandes. This is what they're throwing. They're throwing bullets, fundis, from their slings. All right, so that's the basic thing that they're throwing. They're hurling bullets from their slings. But now, what kind of bullets? Ferventes bullets, something like boiling hot bullets. Why are they boiling hot? That's this part right here, fusilex argilla, from something like molten clay or white hot clay. All right, so this phrase goes with ferventes. And then all of this, ferventes fusilex argilla, is describing the glandes, the bullets that they were throwing from their slings, or with their slings, you could say. So they started to hurl basically molten lead in a sense, well, clay in this case. And they also, this is much easier to understand, they also started throwing spears that had been lit on fire onto the huts. We're going to say huts here, not houses, right? Onto the huts, which, these are the Roman huts inside their camp, which, casas is the antecedent, more Gallico, ablative of manner, in the custom of the Gauls, or in the Gallic custom, were roofed, erant tecti, or literally pluperfect, had been roofed, stramentis, with straw. All right, ablative of means, or technically it's the material with which they have been roofed. So, perhaps unsurprisingly, we know what's going to happen. This would be the casai, the huts, quickly caught fire, literally, comprehenderunt ignem, caught fire, and now you got to watch out here because it might be tempting to read venti as a genitive with this ablative magnitudine, something like by means of the fierceness of the wind. But that's not actually how it's doing, because the venti here is the subject of distulerunt, because that's the only way it makes sense. The wind carried the fire, because the houses didn't carry the fire, the winds carried the fire. So the wind, with its force, literally size, but it's wind, force, carried the fire, still the object of distulerunt, into every place of the camp. All right, so the Roman camp is now on fire. What did the enemy do? Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, maximo clamore, with a very great cry. As if, now this whole thing right here is an ablative absolute, parta iam atque explorata victoria, all right, but it's also in this sicuti phrase. So, as if victory had been like presented and grabbed hold of, or something like that. The idea of parta and explorata is a little bit maybe awkward, right? So the idea is that the victory had presented itself, parta, and then had been confirmed or, cemented, we might say. All right. So they behaved as if they had already won, and what did they start to do? They started to drive the towers and protective cover, we understand, towards the ramparts, and they started to climb the rampart with ladders. So they're pressing their attack because they feel like they have the clear advantage and they're going to win. At. Always a key word. But. And here we see the Romans in the best possible light. Such was, right, because we have fuit, so we can read it that way. Such was the virtue of the soldiers. And literally, it's the exact same expression we use today. The presence of mind. It's just, there it is, the presence of mind. That. Now this ut clause in the sentence with tanta signals to us that this is a result clause. It also happens to make perfect sense, that this was the result of their virtus and praesentia animi. What was the result? So, as we can see, this goes on for quite a while. So let's break it down. Cum clause comes first. This is a concessive clause. So let's read this whole thing as the this whole thing is the concessive clause, and then we'll pick up the ut clause down here with non modo. Although, it's concessive because that's the only thing that makes any sense. Although on all sides by fire they were being scorched. Notice the imperfect subjunctives. And by a huge number of weapons, missile weapons, they were being overwhelmed or, pressed, right? And all of their baggage and all of their wealth, we might say, all of their possessions on fire they recognized. So, indirect speech here is going on, right? They recognized or they understood that everything they owned was burning. Okay? So, even though that was going on, not only, so this non modo is picked up later by the sed, so we have a not only but also type of construction here for the parallels. Not only for the purpose of literally departing, right? So we would say breaking ranks or leaving their post. The gerund, of course, with causa, creating a kind of purpose expression for the sake of departing. No one left from the rampart, right, for the sake of going back to their stuff. Not only did that happen, did no one leave, but indeed, scarcely not a single person at all looked back. And remember, we've seen this ne quidem expression before. It highlights the word that's in the middle. So this is being highlighted as they didn't even look back at their burning camp. And then the quisquam at the end here just punches it home. Not a single one of them. Not any one of them. Even though there's a paine here, I know it's one or two may have, but the effect is still very strong. And then all of them most keenly and most bravely fought. So now this was not an easy fight, as you might expect. This day for our men, the dative here, nostris, right? This day for our men, by far the most severe or serious was. But, nevertheless, it had, that would be the day, right? It had this outcome. That, now since we're talking about an eventum, we understand that this ut is another result clause, because the word eventum is talking about the result. So there we go, here's the result. Let's scroll down and take a look at it. On that day, ablative of time when, maximus numeris hostium vulneraretur. The greatest number, a very great number. You notice how, just a quick note here, we've seen a number of superlatives now. It's mostly been the word maximus. But we have not been translating them as the adjectivist. Instead, with a superlative, we can translate as very. That's totally fine. Very is not really a comparative adjective translation. It's a superlative adjective translation. So if the adjectivist doesn't really work as a translation for you, go ahead and throw a very in there and it'll work. A very great number of the enemy were wounded or killed. Yes, it's atque, but you know, and or, same thing. Now, this ut, let's talk about this ut for half a second. We see these verbs here, constipaverant and dabant. These verbs are not subjunctive. So this ut here is not introducing a purpose or a result clause or a fearing clause or an indirect command or any of that stuff. When we see ut with an indicative like this, we can default to a translation of as. Sometimes just as, but as when in doubt. And then the sense of this ut will help us determine the function. So ut with an indicative like this can be temporal, as meaning when, or in this case, it can be causal. So as works as a translation, but once we understand what's going on, in this case, we know that we can translate with since or because. Since the enemy packed themselves in tightly underneath the rampart itself, so the enemy crowded up too close to the Romans' defenses, and the ultimi, so the ones in the back, were not giving a way of retreat, we would say, to, dative indirect object, the ones in the front. So the enemy, in their eagerness, actually created a situation, because the Romans did not break and run, where it was possible for the Romans to kill huge quantities of them, because their own men charging up from the rear didn't give the guys in front any way to get out, and so they all died. Or at least a very large number of them died. Okay, so now that we know that things are working out well for the Romans, Caesar almost takes a moment here to indulge in just a little bit of levity, because we have a very comical episode here, just in the next couple of sentences. So, we start off with this ablative absolute. Paulum quidem intermissa flamma. So, there was a small break. Paulum here as an adverb. All right, I know it looks like an accusative, because in a previous life it was. This is the neuter accusative singular form of the adjective being used adverbially. All right, so and we can do this with words like multum or magnum or paulum, things like that. So with a small intermission, right, with the flames briefly interrupted, and still an ablative absolute, a tower, this would be a siege tower of the enemy, having been driven, we would say up to the wall, right? We see the wallum down here, but we're not there yet. Having been driven up to the rampart at a certain place, and now touching the rampart, you see, so here we go down to this present active participle, now touching the rampart, the centurions of the third cohort, who were stationed there, from that, we hold this AO in our mind for 1 second and put it with loco. From that spot where they were standing, see how where they were standing is just naturally there. From that spot where they were standing, they recesserunt, they backed up. The centurions did. And they moved all of their troops back, so they indicated to the rest of their men that they should back up. And then what did they do? With nutu and vocibus, so this would be by means of gestures, literally nutus is something like nods, but gestures and voices, so words, they began, we got to come down here, they began to call to the enemy if they wanted to, we would say like asking if, right, we got to fill the blank here for a second, asking if they wanted to come in. So, this is kind of a comedic little moment here. The Romans are feeling pretty good. And of them, this quorum here would be the hostes. Of them, no one dared to step forward. All right. So this quorum here is a partitive genitive working with nemo. None of them, not a single one of them, of the enemy, dared, ausus s, semi-deponent verb. Because it's semi-deponent, even though it looks like it's in the perfect passive form, it's actually perfect active. That's semi-deponents are missing a third principal part. Not a single one of them dared to step forward. progredior deponent verb. And then this mildly hilarious episode ends as you would expect. None of the enemy have dared to step into the Roman camp and face the soldiers, and so rocks were hurled ex omni parte from all sides by the Romans, right? The Romans hurled rocks at the enemies from all sides, and so the enemy this is the enemy now, understood. They were shaken loose or driven back, and then the siege tower was set on fire. So one of the enemy towers was right there, ready to breach the walls of the camp, and the Romans were ready for them. None of the enemy dared to attack, and so the Romans drove them off and burned the tower down. So the Romans have so far held the day, and we will see in the next chapter. The next chapter is actually something quite special. Caesar takes a break from the narrative to relate to us the exciting adventure of two of his centurions, Pullo and Vorenus, and this is one of the most famous episodes in the entirety of the Gallic Wars. So I look forward to joining you in the next video when we look just at that one paragraph, chapter 44. Maximus gratias omnibus et valete.